welcome back to Mark Carney's book club, where I'm taking you through this entire book ahead of the Canadian federal election on April 28th. Today we're going to continue on chapter 7, which is on the global financial crisis, a world unmoored. In part 1, we talked about some of the investment vehicles that were arising, that were creating a shadow banking system outside of the traditional banking system. Now we're going to go into how that contributed to the ultimate crisis. The extreme growth of this shadow banking system caused a dramatic increase in claims within the financial system, as opposed to between the financial system and the real economy, showing just how far the financial system had drifted from its role in serving the real economy. In essence, the shadow banking system practiced maturity transformation without a safety net. That is, it was wholly reliant on the continuous availability of funding markets. The collapse in market liquidity that began in August of 2007 crystallized these risks. The regulatory system neither appreciated the scale of this activity nor adequately adapted to the new risks created by it. The shadow banking system was not supported, regulated, or monitored in the same fashion as the banking system. With hindsight, the shift towards the shadow banking system was allowed to go too far for too long. The securitization of debt had been expanding for decades. Corporate debt, credit card debt, and mortgages were all being packaged into securities and sold to market. In the years preceding the crisis, the value of the outstanding securitizations rose from $5 trillion to $17 trillion just between 2000 and 2007. So buyers of these securities were investment banks, hedge funds, investment funds, money market funds, and SIVs. By the mid-2000s, these shadow banking operations financed about $10 trillion in assets in the US, making it as large as the real banking system itself. A combination of complacency and greed was taking over. Complacency weakened each line of defense, and greed prompted those who ran these investment vehicles to see the interest that they were earning as too modest. In an attempt to increase them, they added riskier assets to the portfolio, like subprime mortgages. He then talks about derivatives, which are financial instruments that derive their value from the value of other underlying variables. By the mid-2000s, the derivative market grew from under $100 trillion in 2000 to over $500 trillion by the summer of 2007. As we were to discover in the autumn of 2007, derivatives had created an enormous inverted pyramid of risk on the backs of homeowners, with the users of derivatives increasingly far removed from the underlying assets. Long gone were the simple days when I had worked at a retail bank in Edmonton and would be sent out to double-check the property valuations we had received. As explained in chapters 4 and 5, the ability of conventional banks to grant mortgages to create money was governed by their risk appetite and constrained by their capital and liquidity requirements. By the summer of 2007, the ability of many banks to underwrite new mortgages was largely constrained by how quickly they could sell off the asset in a securitized pool. The buyer could then pool those pools of mortgages into a CDO2 or hedge risks with credit derivatives. Each step moved further and further away from the homeowner. Nobody ever checked on the house or the homeowner. Finance was increasingly abstract, and not only did people buy and sell mortgage exposures without asking enough questions, they didn't even know who to call. So he says that most in the market saw only a portion of what was going on, and the majority assumed that someone else had asked the right questions and done the hard work. This next section is called Things Fall Apart. And then in the summer of 2007, loose threads began to appear in a few structured credit funds. Pulling on those threads unraveled not just a single sweater, but the whole wardrobe. And it wasn't any wardrobe. It was a walk-in closet, positively Kardashian in its expanse. The Canadian ABCP market was about $32 billion in size. The market was growing nervous because some of the assets were US subprime loans, and many cautious CP investors wanted out. The issue was that many of the assets had been pledged as collateral for credit insurance. When they dug in, they discovered that the amount of credit insured was more than 10 times the amount of the commercial papers. The market value of subprime mortgages was under pressure, and a few credit funds were discovering that there was no market price for their products. Instead, they argued that value should be based on a model of the underlying credit. Unwittingly, they had switched their allegiances from subjective to objective value. The house of cards was tumbling, and Carney describes them doing something so extraordinary he can't believe it happened. So he, along with a large investor in Quebec, and the governor of the Bank of Canada at the time, David Dodge, and the Canadian Department of Finance, They engineered a standstill with the London, New York, and Canadian banks and major investors. So it stopped both the margin calls and the issuance of new commercial paper. The freeze averted short-term disaster and created the possibility of a permanent solution. At the darkest moments over the next 18 months, it looked like the investors might receive only 20 cents per dollar invested, whereas in the end, they received more than 90 cents. Yes, in financial markets, there can be very large differences between intrinsic value and subjective value. From that August-long weekend on, I lived with a sense of foreboding. My colleagues and I realized that if this was happening in relatively staid Canada, on this scale, it must be rampant in the world's largest financial centers. The global securitization and derivative markets were dead men walking. Collectively, they could bring the entire financial system down, and eventually they would. As the complex chains in shadow banking unraveled, a spiral of asset fire sales and liquidity strikes followed, threatening the stability of the entire system and withdrawing access to credit from millions of households and businesses. When sentiment turned, markets collapsed onto each other, and risks that the bank thought had flown to the four winds came home to roost. This is what happens when unbridled faith in markets collides with their limits. These are the consequences of trying to solve market failures by adding more markets. So Carney had many conversations with bank CEOs at the time who were realizing that the risks that they had sold off had only been insured by the equivalent of a Canadian shell company or by a counterparty that had enormous exposure to the now collapsing US subprime market. And those who make decisions to grant loans are doing so only in order to sell them on. Their duty of care diminishes. In the run-up to the crisis, underwriting criteria moved from careful to careless, responsible to reckless. As the quality of underwriting diminished, so did the ethical foundations of finance. Bankers became disconnected from their ultimate clients in the real economy and had no direct view of the impact of their work. So I'll finish off this part with a bit more from the book. And when the music stopped, these masters of the universe turned to the state. They left out the bit about why Canadians, who had never had a chance to ask the questions unvoiced by these masters of the financial universe, should take on the burden. And they left out the implications such behavior would have for moral hazard in the system. For if banks and markets were bailed out from their mistakes, then what was to stop them from taking on greater risks in the future? A continuation of the heads they win, tails we lose finance. How would that promote the values of responsibility, accountability, prudence, and trust that are essential to sustainable finance? At the same time, with financial sectors imploding, economies were in free fall. We didn't have the luxury of wishing things had been done differently. The crisis had to be gripped. So that's it for this part. In part 3, we will go through the lessons in crisis management.